The flight log sits in a filing cabinet at the Naval Historical Center, under accession number 1981.412.6. Handwritten Arabic on the left page, English translation stapled to the right. August 19, 1981. Okba Ben Nafi Air Base, Libya. The scramble order timestamp, 0718 local. The first MiG-23 engine start, 0722. 4 minutes sounds fast until you see what the Americans were doing at 0714. Libyan ground control had detected the American formation at 7:08. 12 aircraft, F-14 Tomcats, providing top cover, and A-7 Corsairs below them, all operating inside what Qaddafi had declared Libyan airspace 2 years prior. The standing order was clear. Scramble interceptors, obtain firing clearance from Tripoli Command, engage. Standard procedure. The problem lived in Step 2. Tripoli Command required personal authorization from the Air Force Operations Center before live weapons could be employed against American aircraft. Not a bad system in theory. You don't want some lieutenant starting World War III over a radar contact. In practice, it meant calls up the chain, officers located, maps consulted, political officers notified. The log shows the approval arrived at 7:26, 8 minutes after the scramble order. The Americans had been doing whatever they wanted for 18 minutes by then. 6 MiG-23 MS Floggers were assigned to the alert rotation that morning. The pilots were already at the flight line when the scramble order came through. They'd watched the radar tracks develop, knew something was coming. Captain Fawzi, something. I spent 2 days trying to confirm his family name. Libyan Air Force records from that period are scattered between 3 countries now and nobody's organizing them. Captain Fawzi climbed into Flogger 502 at 7:20 according to the maintenance log. His wingman, Lieutenant Mansour, took 507. The other 4 pilots were splitting between 511, 514, 518, and 523. All serviceable aircraft, all fueled. Okba Ben Nafi kept birds on strip alert specifically for this scenario. What the base didn't have was 2 runways. They had 1 functional strip and a taxiway that hadn't seen repaving since the Italians left. 6 fighters trying to launch single file while American strike aircraft worked the target area 40 miles north. The timeline gets strange here. Flogger 502 and 507 received taxi clearance at 0723. The others were still running engine checks. Standard 2-ship element. Get the first pair airborne, then the second, then the third. But the approval for weapons release hadn't come through yet. So, Captain Fawzi was taxiing toward a takeoff he couldn't complete, because launching without clearance meant a court-martial, and waiting for clearance meant the Americans would be gone. He waited at the runway threshold. You can see it in the ground control transcript. 3 exchanges between Fawzi and the tower between 7:24 and 7:26. The tower kept telling him to hold. He kept acknowledging. Professional. Disciplined. Furious, probably, but the recording doesn't carry tone. At 7:26, the approval came through. Flogger 502 began its takeoff roll 11 seconds later. By then, the A-7 Corsairs had already fired. The A-7E Corsair II wasn't built for dogfighting. Subsonic attack aircraft, single seat, designed to put bombs on target and get out. VF-41. Black Aces, technically VA-41 when flying Corsairs, but everyone called them the Aces anyway, had launched from USS Forrestal at 5:30 that morning with a mixed loadout. 2 Corsairs carried Rockeye cluster bombs. 2 others carried something the Libyans had never seen used in combat. Lieutenant Commander Michael Davis flew the number 3 Corsair. He joined VA-41 in 1979 after a tour flying A-4 Skyhawks off Coral Sea. His wife was 7 months pregnant when Forrestal deployed in June. He'd mentioned it exactly once during the pre-deployment brief, then never again. Some guys talk about home constantly. Davis kept a photograph in his survival vest, and that was it. His RIO, wait, A-7s don't have RIOs, single seat. His wingman was Lieutenant James Brooks, 2 years out of flight school, first combat cruise. They were flying Cap Station Bravo, a racetrack pattern 40 miles north of the Libyan coast, when the F-14S above them reported Libyan radars going active. Not search radars, acquisition radars. The kind that precede missile launch. Standard doctrine, F-14S own the air-to-air fight, a 7S suppress ground threats. Davis and Brooks broke from the cap pattern at 714 and headed south toward the radar emissions. The AGM-88 HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile, had entered service 6 months earlier. Navy pilots had trained with them at Fallon. The Libyans had no idea the weapon existed. It homes on radar emissions, rides the beam straight back to the transmitter. Fire and forget. You don't even need to see the target. The radar broadcasts, the missile listens, everything else is physics. Davis pickled his first harm at 7:16. The SA-2 guideline radar site at Ras Lanuf went off the air 14 seconds later. Not damaged, off the air. The operators saw the missile coming and shut down, which is exactly what you're supposed to do, except then you can't guide your own missiles and the whole system becomes decorative. Brooks fired his harm 30 seconds after Davis. Different site, same result. Radar shut down mid-track. The F-14S were tracking the Libyan interceptors taxiing at Okba ben Nafi. The Tomcats' AWG-9 radar could see a fighter on the ground from 80 miles out. They were calling it play-by-play. 6 contacts, all stationary, then 2 moving. The timeline places this at 7:23. Davis and Brooks had already turned back north by then. Harms expended, fuel state comfortable, no threats radiating. They didn't know about the MiGs scrambling. The F-14S knew, but that wasn't the A-7's problem. Air-to-air belonged to the Tomcats. Davis and Brooks were Winchester on anti-radiation missiles and headed back to the cap station. Routine suppression mission, textbook execution. They'd be back aboard Forrestal by 0845 for debrief and breakfast. The thing about SEAD missions, suppression of enemy air defenses, is you rarely see the effect. You fire at a radar you can't see. It stops transmitting. Mission complete. No explosions, no gun camera footage, no battle damage assessment. Davis wrote in his after-action report that both missiles guided normally and both target radars ceased operation. 2 sentences. He spent more words describing the weather, clear skies, visibility unlimited, wind from the northwest at 8 knots. Qaddafi issued the shoot-down order in 1979. Any foreign military aircraft crossing the 32nd parallel into what he'd declared the line of death was to be intercepted and destroyed. Blanket authorization, no exceptions. He announced it publicly, printed it in Libyan newspapers, made sure American intelligence heard it loud. The problem was his own Air Force didn't actually operate that way. Libyan military doctrine in 1981 still carried Soviet fingerprints from the advisory period. Centralized control, political oversight, no independent action by field commanders. A fighter pilot didn't just scramble and shoot. He scrambled, requested weapons authorization, received coded clearance, verified the clearance through a second channel, then engaged. 3 layers of approval minimum. This wasn't Qaddafi being cautious. This was the Soviet Air Defense Forces playbook transplanted to North Africa, designed for a military that didn't trust its own officers. The Americans knew this. 6th Fleet Intelligence had Libyan comm procedures mapped since 1979. They knew about the approval delays. They knew Okba ben Nafi had 1 runway. They knew Libyan MiG-23s needed 18 minutes minimum from first radar detection to wheels up with authorized weapons. The morning cap over Sidra wasn't a training exercise that accidentally triggered a response. It was structured specifically to expose how badly the system didn't work. Captain Fawzi and his wingmen sat at the runway threshold for 2 minutes and 40 seconds waiting for clearance. The tower had the authorization by 0726 but still needed to relay it through proper channels. Direct verbal, then coded verification. Fawzi couldn't just take the tower's word. He needed the authentication sequence. The transcript shows him reading back the code at 7:26:30. 11 seconds later, he started his roll. Meanwhile, Tripoli Command was trying to coordinate what they thought would be a 6-ship intercept. The operations center had no real-time data link to Okba ben Nafi. They were working off voice reports relayed through static heavy HF radio. They thought all 6 MiGs were taxiing. Actually, only 2 had reached the runway. The other 4 were still at the ramp dealing with a start cart problem on Flogger 514, one bulky APU, ground unit, backing up 5 fighters. So, the tactical picture in Tripoli showed 6 Libyan interceptors launching against 12 American aircraft. The actual picture was 2 Libyan fighters trying to get airborne, while American F-14s watched from 35,000 feet, and A-7s had already neutralized the SAM umbrella. Nobody in Tripoli knew the SAM sites had gone dark. The radar operators shut down without reporting it. You don't broadcast, "We're hiding," over unsecured radio. Qaddafi's political officer at Okba ben Nafi filed a report 3 days later. I found a partial translation in a Cairo newspaper from 1984. No idea how they got it. The officer blamed insufficient revolutionary spirit among radar crews. Not the system. Not the impossible timelines. Revolutionary spirit. He recommended ideological retraining. The standing order said, "Shoot down intruders." The actual procedure guaranteed the intruders would be gone before anyone launched. And nobody fixed it, because fixing it meant admitting Soviet doctrine didn't work, which meant admitting the entire military structure needed rebuilding, which wasn't happening. So Libyan fighters kept scrambling late to fights that were already over. Flogger 502 rotated at 07:27:04. Gear up 12 seconds later, climbing through 800 feet when the next thing happened. Okba ben Nafi Air Base had 2 runways on the chart. Runway 09/27, the main strip, 10,000 feet of concrete the Italians poured in 1938, and Libya kept patching. Runway 05/23, the secondary, 7,200 feet that existed on paper and in satellite photos, but hadn't seen operational use since 1977. Cracks, FOD, sections where the asphalt had simply given up. You could taxi on it if you went slow and prayed. You couldn't land on it. You definitely couldn't take off with external stores and a combat fuel load. So, 6 MiG-23s trying to scramble meant 6 aircraft queuing for 1 runway. Single file. 1 launches, next one taxis into position, next one waits. At Nellis or Miramar, they'd have birds launching in pairs from parallel runways or in trail 15 seconds apart. At Okba ben Nafi, you got one every 90 seconds if everything worked perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly that morning. Flogger 514 wouldn't start. The APU ground cart had a voltage fluctuation, the start sequence aborted, and the crew chief was cycling the system while Lieutenant Khalid, again, no family name in any document I found, sat in the cockpit watching his flight lead climb out without him. Flogger 518 and 523 were behind 514 in the taxi sequence. Standard procedure said, wait for the aircraft ahead to clear. So they waited. Flogger 511 had taxied around the holdup somehow. The ground track diagram shows it leaving the hardstand on the opposite side using a section of taxiway that was technically condemned but still navigable if you didn't care about regulations. The pilot cared more about getting airborne. He pulled onto the runway at 7:28, 40 seconds behind Flogger 507. 2 aircraft airborne, 1 taxiing into position, 3 still stuck at the ramp. The F-14 Tomcats were calling all of this to Forrestal's Combat Information Center. They could see the heat signatures, the movement patterns, everything. The Tomcats' AWG-9 radar in track-while scan mode could follow 24 contacts simultaneously. Watching 6 Libyan fighters struggle with a traffic jam wasn't reconnaissance. It was spectating. Lieutenant Commander Henry Kleeman was flying the lead F-14. 22 kills in training exercises, 0 in actual combat because nobody had tried him yet. His RIO, David Venlet, was tracking the Libyan fighters and calling their positions. 2 airborne climbing south, 1 taxiing, 3 stationary. The Americans had fuel for another 90 minutes and authorization to engage if threatened. Kleeman wasn't threatened. He was bored. At 7:29, Flogger 511 started its takeoff roll. That made 3 Libyan fighters launching against a cap package that had been on station for 45 minutes. The other 3 MiG-23s were still at the ramp. Flogger 514's engine finally lit at 7:30. By then, Captain Fawzi in Flogger 502 was climbing through 12,000 feet, and his radar was trying to find the American formation. He never did find them. The F-14s were above him in a layer his radar couldn't reach effectively, and the A-7s had already left the area. What he found instead was 2 more MiG-23s climbing behind him, scattered across 20 miles of airspace. No mutual support, no coordinated plan. 3 fighters sent individually against an opponent who'd been waiting in formation for them to arrive. 1 runway. That's what lost the fight before it started. The AGM-45 Shrike had been around since Vietnam. First-generation anti-radiation missile, decent against static targets, limited range, needed constant radar emissions to guide. The AGM-88 HARM replaced it in 1981 and changed everything about how you killed radar sites. Longer range, faster, smarter. The Libyans knew about Shrikes. They'd seen them in Egyptian service, read the intelligence reports. They had no practical experience with HARM because nobody did yet. Too new. Fast Eddie was what Navy pilots called the A-7 Corsair II. Slow compared to fighters, but it carried ordnance loads that made F-4 Phantom drivers jealous. 2 HARMs under the wings meant you could sanitize an entire SAM envelope without entering it. Fire from 40 miles out, turn around, the missile does the rest. Lieutenant Commander Davis and Lieutenant Brooks had done exactly that at 7/16, then headed north. The Ras Lanaf SA-2 site came back online at 7:31. Different radar, same location. They had a backup fan-song guidance radar the operators wheeled out after the first one went silent. Standard Soviet procedure, redundancy saves lives. The new radar started radiating, searching for targets. It found the F-14 cap at 38,000 feet and began tracking. Kleeman's RIO picked up the spike immediately. New threat, same bearing as the previous site. The Libyans had just made the same mistake twice. An F-14 carrying Phoenix missiles doesn't worry much about SA-2s. The guidelines engagement envelope topped out at 60,000 feet in theory, maybe 50,000 in practice, and the Tomcat could kill the launch platform before the SAM ever fired. But procedure said you don't ignore radiating threats. 2 more, A-7s from VA-41, were holding at Cap Station Alpha, 20 miles west. They'd launched with HARMs specifically as backup for this scenario. The strike lead called them in. Same procedure as Davis and Brooks point toward the radar emission, wait for missile tone, fire, confirm the radar stops transmitting. The HARM left the rail at 7:33. The Libyan radar went dark at 7:47. 14 seconds. That's how long the missile needed to cover 35 miles and find the transmitter. The radar operators shut down again, but the HARM has a memory. It remembers where the signal was coming from and flies there anyway. Whether they turned off at second 13 or second 3 didn't matter. The missile arrived. There's no gun camera footage of a HARM impact because the launching aircraft is usually headed the opposite direction when detonation occurs. The warhead carries 145 pounds of high explosive and fragmentation, not designed to obliterate the radar, just wreck it enough that it can't operate. Battle damage assessment came later via satellite. The fan-song antenna was still standing. It just wasn't connected to anything functional anymore. 2 SA-2 sites, 4 HARM missiles, both radars offline by 7:48. The Libyans had 1 more SAM battery further east, but it never radiating that morning. The operators had watched 2 sites go silent and decided survival beat glory. Can't blame them. HARM didn't care about your courage or your orders. It cared about electromagnetic emissions, and if you broadcast, you died. Captain Fozzie's MiG-23 was still climbing at 7:48, searching for targets his ground controllers couldn't guide him toward anymore. No SAM coverage, no radar picture, no coordination. Just 3 fighters scattered across the sky hunting an enemy they couldn't find. The Fast Eddies went back to the cap station and waited. 1 MiG-23 might have gotten shot down that morning. I hedge because the sources don't agree and I've looked hard. The Navy's official account says no Libyan aircraft were destroyed. All 6 MiG-23s returned to base or landed elsewhere. Libyan records, the ones that escaped to Tunisia in 2011, list 1 aircraft lost. Flogger 511. Pilot ejected safely, aircraft destroyed on the ground or during climb-out. The report doesn't specify which. The timeline has problems either way. Flogger 511 started its takeoff roll at 7:29. The F-14S were tracking it. Gun camera footage from Kleeman's Tomcat shows concrete and fire at 7:31, but the angle makes it unclear whether that's runway or hardstand. The smoke could be from an aircraft that never got airborne or one that exploded right after rotation. Maybe 200 feet of altitude, maybe still on the pavement. The film quality doesn't settle it. A CBS News crew filmed from international waters 12 miles north. Their footage, broadcast that evening, shows black smoke rising from Okba ben Nafi around 7:35. One column. Persistent. The reporter claims it was a fuel storage tank hit by American bombs. The Navy says no ordnance was dropped on the airfield. Both might be right if a MiG-23 with full internal fuel and external tanks went down on or near the runway. JP-8 burns impressively. Libyan radio traffic, the parts NSA declassified in 1993, has a gap between 7:28 and 7:42. No transmissions logged. Technical failure, intentional silence, or somebody decided those 14 minutes weren't for sharing. When the recording resumes, the controller is directing 2 aircraft to land immediately. Not 3. 2. Flogger 502 and 507. The other flights aren't mentioned. So either Flogger 511 never made it off the ground and the other 3 MiGs aborted before launching, or 511 got airborne and something happened to it that nobody wants documented. The pilot, if he ejected, never gave an interview. I found references to a Lieutenant Al-Mazik hospitalized in Tripoli on August 20th for back injuries. Could be unrelated. Could be ejection trauma. The hospital records were lost when the facility got shelled in 2011. The Navy maintains no aerial engagement occurred. The F-14S fired no weapons. The A-7S fired HARMs at ground targets only. If a MiG-23 was destroyed, it happened without American ordnance involved. Mechanical failure, pilot error, ground fire from confused Libyan gunners, all possible. The Navy doesn't claim the kill because there's nothing definitive to claim. What's documented? 6 MiG-23s were assigned to scramble. 3 got airborne. 2 landed back at Okba ben Nafi. 1 is unaccounted for in American records and listed as lost in partial Libyan records. The gun camera footage shows fire at the airfield. The CBS footage shows smoke. The radio traffic has a gap. I spent 4 days on this trying to confirm what happened. Contacted 3 separate researchers who've worked Libyan military records. One said the aircraft was destroyed on the ground by secondary explosion. One said it crashed on takeoff due to engine failure. One said the whole story is propaganda and all 6 aircraft landed safely. None of them had primary documentation. So maybe a MiG-23 got destroyed that morning. Maybe it didn't. The smoke was real. The loss report exists. Everything between those 2 facts is contested, contradictory, or missing. Pick whichever version bothers you least. I can't. The gun camera footage runs 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Black and white, 16mm film, frame rate synced to the gunsight pipper. Lieutenant Commander Kleeman's F-14 recorded everything from 7:29 to 7:32, which covers the period when Flogger 511 either exploded on the runway or shortly after. The film shows concrete, a heat bloom, smoke developing from right to left across the frame, then the camera angle changes as Kleeman's Tomcat banks away. What it doesn't show, an aircraft. No MiG-23 silhouette, no visible impact, no debris field identifiable as airplane parts. Just runway, fire, smoke. The heat bloom could be fuel ignition, could be an ammunition cook-off, could be something unrelated to aviation entirely, though that seems unlikely given the timing. The Navy analysts who reviewed the footage in 1981 noted thermal event consistent with aircraft loss, but couldn't confirm aircraft presence in frame. 3 other F-14S were airborne that morning. None of them recorded anything useful. One camera malfunctioned, common problem with the AN/ALQ-130 gun camera pod in humid conditions, and Forrestal had been operating in the Mediterranean summer for 2 months. The other two Tomcats were positioned wrong, too far north to see Okba ben Nafi clearly. Kleeman had the only angle, and his footage is ambiguous. The A-7 Corsairs didn't carry gun cameras on that mission. They had strike cameras for bomb damage assessment, but those only activated when ordnance released. No bombs dropped, no film exposed. Davis and Brooks never saw the airfield directly. They fired HARMs from 40 miles out and turned north immediately after. Their debrief mentions explosions observed, but that was secondhand information from the F-14S, calling play-by-play. Weather data for August 19, 1981, over northern Libya. Temperature 34 degrees Celsius at 0730 local, humidity 68%, wind northwest at 8 knots, visibility 15 kilometers, scattered clouds at 8,000 feet. I mention this because I found the meteorological report in the same archive as the gun camera footage and thought maybe atmospheric conditions affected what the camera recorded. They didn't. Visibility was perfect. The camera just wasn't pointed at the right piece of sky at the right moment. There's a 3-second gap in the film at 7:30:18. Not missing footage, the camera kept running. The lens was pointed at empty air while Kleeman repositioned. When the image returns, the runway is already burning. Whatever happened, happened during those 3 seconds. The fire is established, smoke is rising, and the thermal signature is bright enough to wash out detail in the immediate area. CBS broadcast their footage that evening, with the reporter claiming American aircraft bombed the base. The smoke column in their video matches the location and timing of Kleeman's gun camera fire. But CBS was filming from a boat 12 miles offshore with a telephoto lens. They had no way to see what caused the smoke. They saw smoke, saw American aircraft overhead, made an assumption. The Navy corrected the record the next day. No bombs dropped. The reporter didn't retract the story, just stopped mentioning it. The gun camera footage exists. It shows fire at Okba ben Nafi at 7:30. It doesn't show what caused the fire. 43 years later, that's still the entire evidentiary basis for whether a MiG-23 was destroyed that morning. 3 minutes of ambiguous film and contradictory reports. The footage sits in the National Archives. You can request it. I did. It won't answer your questions. Colonel Ayad al-Tarhouni commanded the MiG-23 squadron at Okba ben Nafi in August 1981. He wasn't flying that morning. Squadron commanders don't fly alert rotations. They manage them. But he was on the flight line when the scramble order came through. He watched Captain Fawzi and Lieutenant Mansour taxi out. He watched whatever happened at 7:30. He filed the after-action report that disappeared into Libyan Air Force archives and probably doesn't exist anymore. He left Libya in 1995. Defection isn't the right word. He resigned his commission, moved to Egypt, and started working as a flight instructor at a civilian aviation school outside Cairo. No drama, no public statements, just a quiet exit. Former Libyan military officers scattered across North Africa and Europe after Qaddafi's purges in the mid-90s. Ayad was one among dozens. A Jordanian journalist interviewed him in January 1996 for a piece on Libyan air combat history. The interview ran in a military affairs magazine that folded in 1998. I found a partial transcript in a university library in Amman. Photocopied, pages 3 and 7 missing. Ayad talked about the Gulf of Sidra incident for maybe 3 paragraphs. He said the Americans knew exactly how long Libyan intercept procedures took. He said the radar sites were hit before his fighters ever launched. He said one aircraft was lost to what he called catastrophic mechanical failure during takeoff emergency. His words, translated from Arabic. The journalist asked if American weapons caused the failure. Ayad said no. He said the aircraft shouldn't have been cleared for flight that morning. Maintenance had flagged a hydraulic issue 2 days prior, but the political pressure to launch everything available overrode technical concerns. He said the pilot ejected successfully and returned to duty 6 weeks later. He didn't name the pilot. He also said the standing order to engage American aircraft was operationally worthless. The approval process took too long. The Americans understood the timeline, and Libyan fighters would always arrive after the enemy had finished their mission and left. He said he'd reported this to command in 1979, 1980, and twice in 1981. Nothing changed. He sounded tired describing it, according to the journalist's notes in the margin. The interview ended with Ayad saying he had no interest in discussing Libyan military affairs further. He was teaching students to fly Cessnas now and preferred it to fighters. The journalist noted he seemed relieved to be done with that life. Colonel Ayad al-Tarhuni died in October 2005. Car accident on the highway between Cairo and Alexandria. Single vehicle collision, no other cars involved. He was 54. The Egyptian traffic report listed the cause as driver error. Fell asleep at the wheel, crossed the median, hit a concrete barrier. His obituary in an Arabic language newspaper mentioned his service in the Libyan Air Force and his subsequent career as a flight instructor. It didn't mention the Gulf of Sidra. I don't know if the pilot who ejected from Flogger 511 is still alive. I don't know if Captain Fawzi survived the next 4 years of Libyan service or the civil war that followed. The squadron itself was disbanded in 1986 after another incident with American aircraft. Most of the pilots transferred to other units or left the military. Some ended up in Egypt, some in Tunisia. Some stayed and died during the 2011 revolution. Colonel Ayad made it out, taught civilian students for 10 years, and died on a highway far from any runway. That's the epilogue. That's the